The truth about my presentation is slightly more trivial. People can read it. I decided to use these 7 or 8 minutes to make a very specific point, and this is also very personal. And my experience is a very specific one. It's an East European that was 25 years old in 1989. And normally, basically, this is very much connected to the idea of a triumph of democracy and big change. But one thing that also stays with every person of my generation is how fast things can change. And when I was reading what we are doing, and when basically I'm reading some of the policy stuff that is discussed and produced, my feeling is that we're in a time in which things start to change very fastly, and we're still not ready, basically, to accept this. We're still not ready to accept the fact that in Bulgaria in the 1990s, on Friday, you don't believe what you have been believing on Monday. There's a series of events, and we're seeing part of it. France, what is happening in the United States, what is happening here and there. We cannot stay with the same conversation. I was very much interested, so I decided to read in the archives what the members of the Soviet Politburo have been discussing in their first meeting after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And they have been discussing the agricultural policies. And basically, the fall of the Berlin Wall was in Varia. And my feeling is that we're in a moment in which the change is so big that some of the discussions, and in a certain way, some of the narratives that we have can get irrelevant in 2 or 3 months because of the events that are happening. And this kind of a sense to share, part of this eagerness for me is very important, because in a moment like this, the worst for a policymaker is if the public decided that we have lost touch with reality. And you can see it on different level, basically. I had the feeling that it happened in some of the countries that voted recently, that basically the agenda of the people and the way they feel is very different about basically how the politicians experience it. And as a result of it, I'm just going to come with 2 things that made a very strong impression on me when I was trying to think about the world of tomorrow on the basis of what probably we're not discussing enough. One is, and this was something that I have been working, thanks to Tim Gartanesh, for the last 6 months in Oxford, was that we, in my view, are totally underestimating the importance of demographic changes in the world. I'm not talking immigration. I'm talking demography. I'm talking that half of the population of the world, basically, have societies which are under the reproduction age with a much basically lower fertility rates and others, and the moral panic that it produced, the fact that people are living with the demographic projections in which in 15 or 20 years the world is going to look totally differently and they cannot relate easily to this world. Why I'm saying this in a kind of a conference that is dealing with foreign policy? Because it is my feeling that we are never going to understand why President Putin decided to invade Ukraine if we are not going to know how preoccupied he was with the idea of Russia's demographic decline. In the months prior to the war, on several occasions, without being asked, he was repeating one and the same phrase, that in 19th century the projection was that in year 2000 there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. And then now there are 140. Nobody is going to understand if we're not focusing on this kind of a demographic anxiety, why Ukrainian kids have been kidnapped and basically adopted in the very first days of the war. This is not a war about land. It's a war about people. And this idea of a world in which you do not have enough people, suddenly, and on the other side, too many people, not enough of us and too many of them, in my view, is something also that is very much describing also certain things that we see. The last Hungarian, the last Pole, suddenly the mortality of the nations became visible. and particularly in the small nations like you have a lot of them on Europe. And my second and last point is also about how, in my view, the idea of the sovereignty is changing. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, to get the recognition, basically, to have the feeling of sovereignty and the result also of status was to be the member of the most prestigious clubs. Joining NATO or European Union or G7 for the great powers, and from this point of view, this was so important. This was like for a young man who wanted to marry in a good family. But suddenly, I do believe that this kind of a family-centered idea of sovereignty was very much transformed, and we are seeing something that in romantic life we see with the emergence of the dating apps. Suddenly, what it means to be sovereign is to have choices. It's not being non-allied. It means to be member of all clubs. You're going to see basically the rising middle powers not siding with the United States or with China or with Russia, but trying all the time to go and to show that we have options. We have been here, we have been there, you cannot basically fix us in anything else. And I do believe we're going to see more of this even happening on the periphery of Europe. Serbia, in my view, is a case of point. You're going to have other case of points. Suddenly, by showing that you have options, you try to convince your populations basically in the sovereignty in a world in which it is not easy to be sovereign because of economic interdependence, because of the many things. And as a result of it, I'm going to end up on this. We have been focusing very much on what Europe should do. And High Representative Borrell is here, and I know that he was very much criticized for this garden-jungle comparison. But the story is not that Europe is garden. The problem is that we think like gardeners. We try basically to garden everybody else. But others are not busy with this. In a certain way, they're much more adjusting to disorder, much more trying to benefit even from the chaos that is going on. And how Europe is going to adjust to this new world, in my view, is a real question, and I'm sure that the colleagues of the ECFR is going to give you the answer to this. Thank you so much.